Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi Bava Metzia, 1 week at a time. This is our second class, so welcome back to our new Masachet. Today we are going to be reviewing Daf 8 to 14. This day of learning has been dedicated by one of our members, Li'ilui Nishmat Shoshana Bat Sophie. So may her neshama have an aliyah, and we are very thankful for the dedication. Okay, we are going to pick up where we left off last week on Daf 8. If you remember, we've been talking about finding an object and how one can acquire that object. We're going to be discussing different ways of acquisition. If you remember, we've learned previously the word, right, kinyan. Kinyan is an acquisition, and there are different ways you can do that. The best way to acquire something would be by lifting it up. So Daf 8 tells us that we see from our Mishnah that if a person lifts an item up, so then they can not only acquire it for themselves, but they can acquire it for someone else. Now, this, right, again, lifting up an item only works if you lift up the entire item. But if you remember our Mishnah when we started, we have two people holding this cloak, this talit, right? One is holding one side and one is holding the other side. So we see that when each person is holding up their half, not only are they acquiring their half, but they're also holding it up for the other person. That's the way that we're going to split this item. So they're lifting it for themselves and for the other person. Or maybe, right, it doesn't work here that each person acquires it for themselves and another person, right? In general, it wouldn't work that you could acquire something for someone else, and we're going to see that a little bit later on in tonight's shiur. Okay, let's say a person makes someone else steal an item for them. So we say that the thief, the person who actually stole the item, is liable, not the person who sent them, because we have a very famous idea or principle in Hebrew, Ein shlichut lidvar avera. You cannot make someone else a messenger for you or an agent for you to do something I was going to say illegal, but something that is asur, something that is prohibited, right? So I can't say, I can't force you to go steal something. If you do it, it's your fault, not mine. But let's say if two partners plan to steal something and then only one of them does it, so they both are liable because they both planned this, right? The theft. And here we say, why are they both liable, even though one actually did the stealing? Because it seems that when you steal something, you could steal it for somebody else, right? You're doing it also for someone else. Another case, let's say you have a deaf mute and a normative person, and they both lift up an item. Now, if you say that you can acquire for the other person as well, so then both of them should acquire it, because even though the deaf mute might not be able to acquire for himself, you can acquire it for him. Or no, maybe just the deaf mute acquires it because he acquires it for himself and the other person acquired it for him as well, but the pikeach, the regular person, doesn't acquire it because the deaf mute can think about him, right? Meaning they don't have each other in mind. Or maybe another option is, right, again, if let's say two deaf mutes lift something, they both acquire it. So too, if they're different, so then maybe they can both acquire it, or no, um, the because the pikeach, the normative person, doesn't acquire it, therefore the deaf mute also doesn't acquire it. Those are all our different statements. Okay, our Mishnah also spoke about two people riding an animal and going into court and saying that they each found it first. So this teaches us that, let's say if one person is riding the animal and the other person leads the animal, then maybe only one of them acquires it. But let's say there was one person. Can you acquire an animal by just riding the animal, or just by leading it? But let's say there are two people. Again, one is riding it, one is leading it. Which one acquires the animal? So the Gemara suggests that the one leading the animal is the one making it move. Therefore, he's the one who acquires it and not the one who's sitting on the back of the animal. Right? The rider is not, he's just sitting there and he's being led. So it's the leader that acquires it. But if the rider is being more proactive, which we'll see in a second, then maybe he would acquire it. So the Gemara gives another example of a person sitting in a wagon led by animals. So if you're sitting in the wagon, you do not acquire the animal. But again, right, even if you're holding the reins, you're still not controlling the animals enough, as opposed to, let's say, if you're riding on the animal, so then you would acquire it. So again, here the Gemara says that if you are leading the animal with your legs, or somehow, right, not just sitting on the animal, but leading the animal with your legs, so then you do acquire the animal by riding it. Now the Gemara talks about different types of animals. So let's say we have two people leading a camel or a donkey, or one is leading and one is pulling. So then they acquire the animal. And then on Daf 9, the Gemara tells us that for different animals, we have different ways to acquire them. So for a camel, right? You might need to pull the camel, and you can lead the donkey. But all of these show that riding it isn't enough. Or no, maybe riding would be enough to acquire these animals. But let's say you pulled a donkey, that's not the way to acquire it. And leading a camel is also not the way to acquire it. Okay, then the Gemara has a whole discussion about riding a donkey, right? So one person is riding the donkey and another one is holding on to the bridle, like the I don't think it's called the reins, but right, the piece that's attached to the head of the animal. Maybe, I guess, reins, whatever you want to call it. So then, again, maybe the person riding the donkey acquires the donkey, and the person holding the reins would acquire the reins, but not the donkey. Again, it depends who is causing the animal to move. Okay, the next part, so we said riding, again, you have to be leading with your feet. And then the Gemara discusses where people ride animals. So usually people don't ride their animals in the city. It's too hectic, it's too busy. Therefore, if you ride the animal in the city, it's not the way to acquire the animal. Or no, even if it's not the normal way to do it, if you do it, it does work. But you can't buy an animal this way because, again, that's not the normal way to buy an animal in the city. Let's say you're riding the animal in the public domain, in the Reshut HaRabim. that is the way to acquire the animal because it's normal. And if you're an important person who always rides, so then wherever you ride the animal, that would be appropriate. So to a woman, it was normal for a woman to ride anywhere, and therefore a woman could acquire the animal by riding it. Okay, let's say a person says, right, pull this animal for me so that you can acquire the utensils that are on the animal. So the question is, does that work? Um, so, do you acquire the utensils by pulling the animal? So the question is, again, here, you're not acquiring the animal as well. If you were acquiring the animal and then you would definitely acquire the utensils on the animal. But we're not saying that. We're saying pull the animal so that you can acquire the pots and pans that are on top, not so that you can get the animal. So the Gemara is not sure if that would work, right? Again, if you buy the animal, so you would get the utensils that are on it. Then the Gemara says, but wait a minute, isn't this like what's called a moving courtyard? Right? We've learned before that a courtyard, and we'll see also later today, a chatzer, a courtyard, can acquire the things that are in it, right? So if you buy a courtyard and there are things in there, you acquire them when you buy the courtyard. Now, in general, a chatzer, a courtyard, doesn't move, right? It's land. But, right, again, this animal, if it has utensils on it, you're acquiring the utensils when you acquire the animal, but that animal moves. And we know that you really should not be able to acquire things from a moving courtyard. So the Gemara says, oh, the case is that the animal was tied up at the time. Therefore, it's seen as a stationary courtyard, chatzer, and therefore you acquire the utensils that are on the animal. Same thing with a boat, right? If, let's say, fish jump into the boat, you can acquire them. Again, even though the boat is moving, the Gemara says, it's not actually the boat is standing still. It's the water that's moving, which I thought was very interesting. And again, this discussion of stationary versus mobile. Okay, the next Mishnah on Daf 9 tells us that a person was riding an animal and they saw an object on the floor. And then, again, so let's use names. Reuben is riding the animal. He tells Shimon, who's standing on the floor, he says to him, oh, can you do me a favor and pick up that can of Coke over there? Right? I saw this can of Coke. I want it. It's nobody's. So can you pick it up for me? Now, Shimon can pick up the can of Coke and be like, look what I just found. I found a can of Coke. And he can acquire it for himself. But if Shimon picks up the can and gives it to Reuven, who is sitting on the donkey, so then he can't say afterwards, oh, you know what? When I picked it up for myself. As soon as he gives it to Reuven, that's it. It becomes Reuven's. It's not Shimon's anymore. So now the Gemara explains from another case. The case here is pe'ah. If you remember, pe'ah literally means corners. These are gifts that were given to the poor people when you were harvesting your field. You need to leave the corners of your field for the poor people. So the question is, can one person collect pe'ah, but collect it for somebody else, not for themselves? So the question is, can you say like, oh, I'm picking it up, I'm going to give it to my friend Leah? Or does it have to be that the first poor person you pass on the street, you need to give it to them? You can't just give it, take it back to your friend. So the Gemara explains that the machloket is depends who is picking this up. If the person picking it up is rich, so then um, he can actually acquire it for a poor person. And therefore, he can give it to whoever he wants. Everyone agrees that if he's poor, he could acquire it for another person, but maybe if you're rich, you cannot. Again, because the rich person does not get payah, or all people are seen as poor people when it comes to found items, right? Again, anybody who's walking down the street can pick up the can of Coke that's just left there on the street. Therefore, you can acquire it for another person. Therefore, when Shimon picks it up, right, he's actually picking it up for Reuven. Reuven asked him to pick it up. He's picking it up. Or maybe he has the option when he picks it up to say, no, I'm picking it up for myself. I'm not picking it up for you. Okay, Daf 10 tells us that if Shimon says, again, Reuven is on the donkey, Shimon was told to pick up the item. So let's say Shimon says, oh, I acquired it first, so then he gets to keep it. If he didn't say I acquired it first, so then he does not have the opportunity to say that it's his. Okay, let's say you lift up an object only for a friend, right? For somebody else. So the Gemara actually says you do not acquire it for the other person because it causes a disadvantage for everybody else, right? I could have taken the can of Coke, you could have taken the can of Coke. So when I pick it up, it would be is that a word? Disadvantageous? I don't think that's a word. But it would not be good for everyone else, therefore it doesn't work. Let's say a worker who was hired, right, to hire help in your house, find something, not in your house, let's say out in the field. So the question is, can the worker, oh, it is a word, thank you. Can a worker acquire something that they find in the field while they're working for another person? So one opinion is they could keep it. Another is that it goes to their employer because the employer hired them to work, right? You're working for me 9 to 5. If you find something, during that time, so it should go to the employer because at that point, you are being employed by somebody else. If you decide to quit, right, if you're in the middle of working and you find $100 bill on the floor and you're only making $50, so you could say, you know what, I quit, I don't want to work anymore, pick up the $100 and move on, right? You can acquire it for yourself. And the Gemara does conclude that you can acquire an item for a friend, even though you do not have any part in it. But again, he had to say that you did, you have to say you're doing it for the other person. And if you say you did it for yourself, it would work as well. Okay, next Mishnah. Reuben saw an object on the floor and he falls on it. And then Shimon comes and he pulls it out from under Reuben. So who gets it? I feel like we're talking about 5-year-olds, arguing over like a stuffed animal, but it's basically this, but in adults. So the Gemara says the person who picks it up first acquires it. So Reuben falling on the item does not acquire it. Shimon picking it up does. So the Gemara explains that it's, first of all, it's important. Yes, Ilanit said that if it's like a football, right? Like playing football, everyone just jumps on the ball. But it really goes on to who's holding it. Great analogy. So the Gemara explains that really a person has, right, and I think we talk about this in halacha a lot. Everyone has dalid amot, right, 4 amot, 4 cubits of space around them. That becomes your private space, even if you're in a public domain, right? I think in Western culture, we would call it, right, this is my personal space or my bubble. Don't go into my personal space. So it does have halachic ramifications. So the truth is that you do acquire things that are within your dalid amot, even without lifting it. And the Gemara says that the rabbi said this so that people wouldn't fight over, right, who's going to pull it faster, right? And this way, if I'm standing and it's in my, right, a few spaces away from me, so it becomes mine as long as I say that I'm acquiring it. Now, right, again, let's go back to pe'ah, right? Poor people collecting in the field. So the Mishnah in Pe'ah explains that if, let's say, you pick some of the Pe'ah, which is yours, and now you throw it on top of the rest of the Pe'ah, you don't acquire everything that's underneath it. It doesn't work like that, right? Also, like if you fall on it or if you cover it with your coat, none of those things acquire the item for you. It just made me think about like when you save seats and you put the jacket across like 5 seats. So on one hand, right, are you saving it? Are you not saving it? So that's interesting. So here it's saying you cannot acquire anything in that way. Right? Again, now the truth is that if you would have said, everything in my dalid amot is mine, that would work. But if you don't say that and you just throw things on top of it, so then it doesn't work. Or, right, the Gemara says, no, maybe if you fall on it, you're showing that you're trying to acquire it with your body and not with my personal space. Or the Gemara suggests that dalid amot only work in general, but in someone else's field, it doesn't work, right? If you want to acquire the wheat or the grain, right, you need to actually pick it up. You can't just fall on it. Okay, and the same thing with a found item, right? Again, like if you fall on it, so you're saying that you don't want it to be acquired because of your personal space. You want to acquire it because you're like lying on top of it. And then the Gemara says, well, maybe these 4 amot, it only works in an alleyway, like in a private or semi-private area, but not in the public domain. So that it would not work in the public domain. Okay. Now we're going to talk about, and we'll see it also later, a minor, right, a young girl, a ktana, doesn't have the ability to acquire, here the Gemara is talking about her get, and we did see this in Gitin, when we were talking about bills of divorce. They have to be given to the woman. So one option is, and we did see many cases like this, where let's say the husband, now again, nowadays you can't do this, but in the time of the Gemara, we have cases of, let's say, the husband throwing the get into the woman's courtyard or into, right, her personal space within 4 amot of the girl. So then here it's saying that a minor, a ktana, a woman, a girl, doesn't have the ability to acquire the get with the act of her courtyard or with her personal space. Or no, maybe for a ktana, you have to actually put it in her hand. She doesn't have the ability to acquire through these other mechanisms, right? A courtyard or her personal space. And here the Gemara discusses, the Gemara discusses what is kinyan chatzer. How do you acquire something with a courtyard? is it an extension of your hand? Meaning, just like you put the get in your hand, your courtyard is something that you own, therefore you put it in the courtyard. It's as if you put it in her hand. If that's the case, a ktana, a minor, she could acquire something if you put it in her hand. So then she would, if the courtyard is like her hand, so she should be able to acquire it in the courtyard. Or maybe the courtyard is like her agent, right? And we saw this a lot in Gitin, right? A woman can send an agent to accept the divorce for her, but a minor, a ktana, cannot send a shaliach, an agent. And therefore, if the courtyard is an acquisition like an agent, so then it would not be valid for a minor. If it's like her hand, then it would be valid. So the Gemara tries to see, is it like her hand or is it like an agent? Okay. Next, and then there's a Breita that says it's actually, right, the courtyard is like her hand. And everyone agrees that for a get, it would be like her hand. But for there's a machloket for a found item of a minor, right? If a young girl finds an item, the question is, can her courtyard acquire it? Do we learn it from get or not? Okay, Daf 11, the next Mishnah tells us that, let's say a person saw people running after an ownerless animal. Or they saw a deer who was running with like a broken leg. Again, deer run very fast, so if the leg is broken, it means it's running very slowly, so meaning they could catch it. Or let's say chicks that haven't flown yet. So the person sees all of these, right, these people running after this animal, and he sees that the animal is in his field. He can say, my field should acquire this animal for me, right? Again, because it's on his field, so the field should be able to acquire it. And that is valid. But if the deer was healthy, so then the field cannot acquire the animal for him. Because again, the assumption is he would never have caught up to that animal. If a deer is running, you're not going to catch it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how the field can acquire something for the person. So the Gemara explains, a field can only acquire an item if the owner of the field is there, right, next to the field. He doesn't have to be in the field, but he has to be next to the field. And if the field isn't guarded, meaning if it doesn't have like a fence around it, but if it is guarded, then the field can actually acquire the item, even if the owner wasn't there. Now, before we were talking about pe'ah. Now the Gemara is going to talk about shichacha. Shichacha is if an owner or the workers forgot some of the produce in the field, and they leave they forget it in the field, that produce becomes ownerless and it's set aside for the poor people. So now, how do you determine forgot? Right, so let's say if the owner didn't forget about it, maybe it's not shichacha, meaning even if the worker forgot about it, if the owner didn't, so it's not shichacha. If the owner, let's say, is in the city, meaning not in the field, maybe it's seen as shichacha because the owner wasn't there, or maybe not, right? Does he need to be in the field for it to not be shichacha, right? Does he have to be in the field? So if he's in the field and he forgot about it, so then it's called shichacha. If he forgot it and he is still in the field, maybe it's not shichacha because it's still in his domain. If he's in the city, meaning he left the field, Shichacha, then it becomes shichacha because he's not there, again, because he's not in the field. So again, then the Gemara says, wait a minute, maybe we can't learn from shichacha because maybe there's a special law about that. It's a special verse. And if you're not next to the field, then it's seen as left. Yes, exactly. So Ilanit is asking, right? If a delivery guy puts your package by the doorstep, right, in your property, it's as if you've received it. So then, right, the question is, who has liability for that package, right? If it's stolen, is it your fault? Is it Amazon's fault? So it's a great question, right? Does it have to be that you needed to be home and then you acquired it? Or no, it doesn't matter, right? So that's why I think it's interesting. That's why it's talking about a guarded field versus a not guarded field, right? So if I put something on your porch and everybody can see it, I don't think that that's called guarded. If I put it in, somewhere where people can't see it, so maybe that would be seen as guarded. Okay, now we have a story about Rabban Gamliel, who was on a boat, and then he remembered that he had produce at home that he forgot to separate trumot and maasrot, right? To separate all the gifts you're supposed to give to the poor people or to the kohanim or leviim. So what did he do? And he didn't want to leave it in his house unseparated. He wanted to make sure it was separated already. Now he's not home. He's on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean. What does he do? So he says, right, the maser that's there, I'm going to give to Rabbi Yoshua. And the area, right, the piece of property that it's standing on is rented to Rabbi Yehoshua. And Rabbi Akiva, right, the maser for the poor is going to go to Rabbi Akiva and the land that's on it. But again, now the Gemara says, wait a minute, but they're not standing next to the field, so how could they acquire it? So the Gemara says, well, what's the mechanism by which they're acquiring it? Maybe it's agav, right? So I'm going to rent you this property, and because the barrel is sitting on the property, it becomes yours. Or maybe chatzer, again, your courtyard. So again, this shows that the courtyard, right, that your property can acquire something even if you aren't there. So the Gemara says, no, it's different with maaser because that just needs to be given. So over here, it could work, but for other things, not necessarily, right? To acquire something that is lost, maybe that wouldn't work. The next idea is a get. Right, so when you give a get, right, again, she needs to be near the courtyard if you're going to throw it into her courtyard to be divorced. And again, the Gemara says, well, a get is different. Remember, we said you have to actually give it. You have to give it to the woman directly, and she needs to be there. Okay, Daf Yud Bet 12 tells us that, again, the courtyard is actually an extension of your hand and not agency, but for a gift, it is good if it's good for the person, so then you don't have to be next to the courtyard or next to the field in order to acquire it. Okay, we said that you can acquire the deer in your field. And now the Gemara adds, it has to be that if you ran, you could reach the deer before it would leave your field. In that case, the courtyard or the field can acquire it for you. But for a gift, you can acquire it even if you can't catch up to the person or the item. Again, the field acquires the animal even though it's running through the field and it never stops, right? I understand if something was sitting in the field or standing in the field, it would be acquired. But what if it's running? How do you acquire it? So the Gemara says that when it's running, right, every time the foot that hits the ground, it's standing, even though for a second. So it's seen as touching the ground, and the field does acquire it. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that a person can acquire a found item that his minor children found, right? Meaning if you have a 10-year-old child and they pick up $100 and they're like, ooh, look, I found $100. Halachically, technically, the parent acquires the $100 and not the child. So too, if the non-Jewish slave finds something and if the wife finds something. And we saw this in many Masechtot in Seder Nashim, that the mitziot, the things that a woman finds, go directly to her husband. Again, the idea is that they have a joint estate, right? He is supporting her, therefore, whatever she brings right in goes to the estate. Okay. However, right, the found items of your adult children, your Jewish slaves, or your divorced wife, all of those go to the people that found them, and not to the man. So now the Gemara is going to explain. So the first question is, why does the child, when they pick it up, why does that item go to the parent and not to the child? So one answer is because the intent is to give it to the parent, right? When a child picks it up, they're assuming that they're going to give it to the parent. They're not going to keep it. So it goes to the parent. And then the Gemara says, well, no, the question is, can a child, right, again, a minor under 12 or under 13, can a child acquire something for themselves or no, and therefore it goes directly to the parent? So the Gemara again gives, it's funny, we did pe'ah, we did shechecha, so now we're going to do leket, right? These are the three gifts that you have to give to the poor people when you harvest your field. So we said pe'ah was the corners, shechecha was when you left something in the field. Leket is as they're harvesting what drops, you're allowed to pick up. Again, specific laws. So the question is, let's say there's the worker who's in the field and he's harvesting the grain. Can his son walk behind him and pick up whatever the father drops in order to basically give it to the father? So the Gemara says when the child is picking it up, is he picking it up for himself or is he picking it up for his father? And that's a machloket, and we see that there's a machloket whether the child can acquire it for himself. So the Gemara says no. In general, a minor cannot acquire for himself. But in this specific case of leket, he can acquire it for himself, because the other poor people around, either have sympathy or they feel that it's okay for him to do this. Okay. And we did talk about before, before we were talking about that, if a worker found an item while they were working for their employer, we said that the item has to go to the employer. So then what the Gemara asks, why would our Mishnah say that a Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, if he finds something, the Mishnah says he gets to keep it. So the Gemara asks, why would he be able to keep it? shouldn't he um, shouldn't he have to give it to his master, right? If the worker has to give it to the employer, shouldn't the slave have to give it to his master? So the Gemara says, no, we're dealing with a highly skilled slave, where the master never thought about owning or acquiring anything that this slave would find, and therefore, if he finds something, he can keep it. Okay. If, let's say, the a person owns what's called an ama ivriya, a Jewish maid servant. Now she has to be under 12, because at 12 she would go free. Either she would marry the master or his son. If not, she would go free. So if she's younger than 12 and she's Jewish and she's owned by another person, anything she finds actually goes to her father and not to her master. Okay, the Gemara says, what does it mean the divorced woman gets to keep her item? So it has to be a very specific case. Obviously, if you're really divorced, you get to keep whatever you find. But here the case is a woman who is divorced but not divorced. If you remember, in Masachet Gitin, we talked about cases where we weren't sure, there was a doubt if the get was valid, and therefore this woman is right, we don't know if she's divorced or not, and in that case, even though we're not sure, and even though the husband needs to support her, whatever she finds, she gets to keep. Okay, next Mishnah. A person says, a person's walking down the street and they find an IOU document, right? Reuben owe Shimon $100, right? Or you can call it, maybe a blank check. Now, if it has a lien, now, again, a blank check, I guess, is not the best example, because it has to be, you have to know who's, it's Reuben and Shimon, right? It has to be who borrowed from who. If there's a lien on property, on land in this IOU document, you cannot return it to the lender. Now, again, an IOU has power. If it's in the hands of the lender, so then it means he can now use it to collect the money. If it's in the hands of the borrower, so now it becomes a receipt. Look, I already paid you. I have the receipt. The right IOU goes to the borrower after he pays it. So the question is, we don't know if the person paid it or not. So if there's a lien on the land, you cannot give it to the lender. If there isn't a lien, you can return it to the lender, or Chachamim say you can't return it to anybody ever. It doesn't matter if there is a lien on property or not. So now the Gemara is going to explain, right? What's the case, right? If the borrower admits to borrowing money, but maybe we're concerned that this document was written before the money was actually given, right? So again, let's say, right, the Gemara talks about the document was written in Nisan, right, in April, right? Reuben owes Shimon $100, but he never got the money, right? He only gets the money, let's say, in Tishrei, right, around Rosh Hashanah time. That's much later. Now, what's the difference? Whenever he gets the money, property that he owned from then on, at that point, become collateral for that loan. But if you write the document in April, and you didn't give the money, so the property is not collateral till you give the money. So the question is, right, what do we do with this property, right? Maybe the lender will now try to seize the land and it doesn't belong to him because he only gave the money in September or October, right? So generally this isn't the case. But because the document was lost, again, we found it on the floor. I don't know if someone dropped it. Maybe they just threw it in the garbage and there's another document somewhere. So therefore, we suspect that maybe it isn't a valid document. Okay, Daf 13. The Gemara says you are allowed to write a certain type of document called a document of acquisition, a shtar hakna'ah. You can write it for the borrower, even if the lender isn't present, because in this document, the borrower obligates himself to pay, even if he doesn't get the money now. And therefore, the lender doesn't have to be there because either way, it's win-win for him. Therefore, if you find a regular loan document on the floor, so then you don't have to return it to the lender, because again, we don't know when the money actually changed hands. Now, when the witnesses sign a document, they make it valid from that date, right? So if the witnesses sign that Reuben lent Shimon $100 on, right, on Aleph Adar, so then the loan goes into place on Aleph Adar, right? Even if the money is given later, it doesn't matter because that's when they signed the document. Now, a Mishnah says that if you find a document on the ground, you don't return it because maybe, as we said before, maybe it was never given, or right, again, it was thrown in the garbage, or they decided not to use it. But maybe if the witnesses validate it, then you could give it back, or no, because again, you don't. Because again, we're concerned that this document was never given in the first place. Now, the Mishnah said that we don't return the document to the lender, right? Even if the witnesses validate the document, because now we're concerned that maybe the lender and the borrower are scheming to get the land from the buyer. Now, again, what's the case? Reuven lends Shimon money. He puts this piece of property on lien, right? There's a lien on the property. Now, in the meantime, Shimon sells this property to Levi. Now, what happens? Reuven goes to Shimon for his $100. Shimon says, I don't have it. So then he takes the property from Levi, right? Because it's collateral. Now, we're concerned maybe Reuven and Shimon got together and said, oh, let's say that you owe me money, right? And you didn't pay for it. We'll take the land from Levi and then we'll split the profit. So because of that, again, we don't return the documents because we're concerned maybe they're scheming together. Or we say, no, we're not concerned that they are scheming. Okay, so again, we say, who do we return? Let's say you do return a document. Do you return it to the lender? Do you return it to the borrower? Now, if the borrower admits to the loan, then everybody agrees that you give it to the lender, and we do not have to suspect that they are scheming together. Or maybe the machloket is, even if he admits it, but if he denies it, then everybody agrees you don't return it to anybody because maybe there is a scheme. Now, again, the Gemara says that if you do find this document with a guarantee, with a lien or collateral of land, even if both agree, right, the lender and the borrower, you do not return it to either because we are concerned that they are scheming together. But on Daf 14, our last Daf for today, if you do find a shtar hakna'ah, that's the one that says you acquire this land right away, so then you can return it to the lender because you've already admitted that it is it can go to the lender. Or no, again, maybe you don't return it because maybe you already paid it back and now you're giving it to him again to collect it again. Okay. The sages hold that if there is not achrayut on the document, meaning there's no lien on any property, the sages say that's a mistake in the document. Of the scribe actually made a mistake. Therefore, in general, every document has a lien of land behind it, and therefore you can never return the document, even if the achrayut, if the warranty isn't written on it, because they could always go and collect with this document. From here, the Gemara tells us that there are three things that have to be in every document. One is what's called shevach. If the land is repossessed by the lender, the seller has to compensate the buyer, not just for the land, but also any improvement that he made to the land. That's number one. Number two is that if you're compensating for the land that was seized, you have to compensate it with your best land, and that the loan has to have a lien on the property, right? So this shows that every document needs all three of these things. So the Gemara says, no, all loan documents need these three things, but a sale document does not need all these three things. Okay, now the Gemara gives different cases of different sales. So let's say Reuven, who borrowed money, he can try and prevent the lender from taking the field away from a person that he sold it to, right? So again, Reuven borrows money from Shimon, and Reuven had a certain piece of land that he put in lien for the loan, and then he sells it to Levi. Obviously, Levi knows that this land was collateral for a loan, which is why he probably paid very little for it, because there is risk. But the question is, can Reuven stop Shimon from going to take the land from Levi? So one option is that he can, right? Reuven can't get involved if there was no achrayut in the sale, right? If there was no guarantee in the sale, so then Reuven can't get involved when he tries to seize the land. Let's say Reuven sold his field to Shimon, but it wasn't Reuven's field. He actually stole it from somebody. So Levi now, he stole it from Levi. So Levi comes to get the field from Shimon. Shimon now goes to Reuven to get his money back for the field. Plus, he gets to get shevach, right? Anything that he improved the field with. Or no, he only gets the price that he paid for the field, but he doesn't get the money for the improvement. Why? Because now it looks like you're charging interest to a loan. And therefore, right, again, because it wasn't his field, so it looks like you're just giving him money. If you're just giving him money, that's a loan, and now you're giving him more money, so now that's interest on the loan. Okay, if a creditor comes to collect a field, so he can pay the shevach, right, the improvement from any field that he has that's free, but not if someone stole the field, right? Then you do not pay shevach, that added value. If a person stole a field and then sold it, and then the person he sold it to improved it, and then the original owner comes and takes the field, so again, you return it with the improvement. Okay, so now if let's say a person stole the field, and the field had lots of produce on the field. So now, and then the thief eats all the produce and then ruined the field. So when the owner comes to get compensated, he gets compensated for the field from any piece of land that this person owned, even if he sold it, right? It had a lien on it, so then he can take it. But for the produce, he can only collect from the free fields that the person has in his possession, not things that were sold after this happened. Okay, we are going to stop here, and we will pick it up next week with Daf 15. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom. I'll stop the recording, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone.